If you'd asked me that question a year ago, the answer would be really different to today, because honestly, the Lord is really at work in the UK, and I think in the English-speaking world, drawing people to Himself in a wonderful way.
Welcome to the Innovative Church Leaders Podcast. I'm your host, Eric Bryant. In every episode, we bring in guests who will inspire, encourage you to be more effective in your mission field. Well, on today's episode of the Innovative Church Leaders Podcast, I'm excited to have with me Dr. Amy Orr-Ewing. How are you doing, Amy?
Yeah, great. Thank you. It's wonderful to be here with you.
Well, I'm very excited to hear more of your ministry. Your books come highly recommended. We have some mutual friends in the film industry over there in the UK. And I just wanted to hear from your perspective as a theologian, a speaker, a writer, how are you seeing God at work in even post-Christian UK or in places where people may have given up hope, but there seems to be some signs of renewal? I'd love to hear from your perspective.
Absolutely. If you'd asked me that question a year ago, the answer would be really different to today, because honestly, the Lord is really at work in the UK, and I think in the English-speaking world, drawing people to Himself in a wonderful way. I've been involved in apologetics, public evangelism, public theology for over 25 years, and we've been through different phases. That initial kind of when I was starting out, postmodernism, all truth is relative, and you're just trying to encourage people to consider Jesus when they think, oh, it doesn't matter, always lead to God. And then that period around the kind of, 2008 to sort of 2015, where it's lots of new atheism, they're kind of very aggressive. God does not exist. Your God is evil, your ideas of God cause great harm, that kind of thing. And then we went into a period where you had the rise of identity politics and woke culture and kind of rage and grievance and this sort of sense of a generation feeling absolute moral outrage about the injustice in the world, including kind of historic injustices connected to the church. But just in the last, not even year, probably 6 to 8 months, this incredible stirring of a re-engagement with Christian faith, whether that's with public intellectuals like Sir Neil Ferguson or Ayaan Hirsi Ali or Tom Holland or Jordan Peterson, people being very drawn to the idea of God and the Judeo-Christian worldview, and then actually finding faith in Jesus Christ and publicly declaring it. That's happening at a sort of higher level in academia. And then we've just had research published by the Bible Society here in the UK showing a huge increase in young men in Gen Z saying they go to church. That statistic has gone up in the last 5 years from 4% of young men saying they go to church, 21%,
Wow.
which is absolutely extraordinary. And then just, the experience of preaching, I preach in a lot of different churches around the world, but including here in the UK, and just seeing young men coming who, off the street, never been to church, may have been invited by someone, may not have even been invited, showing up and hearing the gospel and putting their faith in Jesus.
Yeah, it is
wonderful.
Remarkable. It is. And I would love to hear, obviously we know it's the Spirit of God at work, but what do you say to those church leaders, pastors who want to see that? And maybe they're eager to know, certainly in addition to prayer, not to diminish that at all, but what are some other ways that you think God has used the church in the UK to stoke this?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So I think prayer is really key. Just in London, on Friday, so like 4 days ago, as part of the Awakening Project, there was a whole night of prayer. So young people in their, students in their late teens, early 20s, praying through the night for their own generation. So God is stirring something in the young people in the church towards a seriousness about him, a re-engagement with his holiness, the truth of the scriptures. So not a dumbing down or a dialing back on things that perhaps leaders have thought are quite hard to preach into, whether that's our kind of moral or ethical framework and stance or the historic truths of the Christian faith. Like, it's a robust gospel people are responding to. So definitely prayer. And then I think seeing in the wider culture, I would say I noticed it about 4 or 5 years ago. I have teenage sons, that their generation, including many of their friends who don't have Christian faith, just really engaging with, podcasters, obviously people like Joe Rogan and Jordan Peterson. And then the darker end of that, of course, Andrew Tate, captivating the minds and imaginations of young men. But what you had there was an audience wanting to, not Andrew Tate, but definitely Jordan Peterson, wanting to be talked to about God, also how to live, including, making difficult choices and doing hard things. And so I think a part of it for us as church leaders is to actually hear the cry in the culture, a longing for proclaimed long form content, which obviously we would call preaching, but needs to be engaging, but challenging, not like make the bar so low that it means nothing at all. And meeting in particular those questions of young men. And so I think there's a requirement on us to engage intellectually with the questions and the things that are bubbling away in the culture. Those are things to do with purpose, massive engagement with wellness, so anxiety, questions around how to live, how to establish a solid foundation to my life if everything around me has been very chaotic. And of course, the moral foundations of the West have sort of been eroded. So there's loads of opportunity there. And then the interest in Jesus of Nazareth, the Christ of history. Like, let's talk about him. Let's preach about him. And, people are there for it. It's wonderful.
Yeah, it really, really is. And I do think, I think Mark Sayers describes, secularism has failed. The promise of what was to be, these young adults are growing up and they don't see a path towards owning a home or getting a job. And so there's this promise of secularism that opens the door for faith. And so you've written some really wonderful books that I think can really be a great resource. We'll be giving away several of your books to those who already have the email newsletter. You can sign up for that at my website. Talk about, you have one on suffering, one on the top 10 questions people ask. Maybe share some of the insights from each of those books. I'd love to hear more on that.
Thank you. Yeah. So my book, Why Trust the Bible, has 10 questions people ask about the Bible. And these are questions like, what about God in the Old Testament? Kind of love and justice. How are those reconciled? Questions like, isn't the Bible sexist? The kinds of questions that if someone is a seeker and they are finding themselves in church for the first time, they don't really know much about the Bible, a book that is really meeting the needs of a seeker like that. My other book, But Is It Real?, is dealing with 10 kind of broader questions. Again, questions about judgment, questions about hell, the sorts of questions about suffering, the kinds of questions that when you're really considering Christian faith are important. And then I've written a book called Where is God in All the Suffering? I was just doing an open forum in a city on that topic last week, and hundreds of people who don't know Christ came to a kind of public venue in that city to engage with that question, which is, of course, a deeply personal question for almost everyone who's ever lived, whether it's people we care about or, in our own lives and experience of injustice, suffering, trauma, how do we square that with God? But it's also an intellectual question. And there is this renaissance of intellectual openness to belief in God. So I feel like we need to be there for that too.
Yeah.
So how do we reconcile, God being loving and all powerful and there being suffering in this world? So those are some of the books.
Yeah, and in this topic of suffering, I want to talk about some of your advocacy work. And I think it's important that the church is seen as jumping into
Yeah.
the tragic injustices of the world and being a part of the solution. But before we do that, just maybe philosophically or theologically, what do you say to the person who says, I cannot believe in a God when there's so much suffering in the world? You're on an elevator. It's not a big trip, but what do you point them to in that moment?
Yeah. Honestly, it would really depend on who the person is and a lot of things about them, from their facial expression to tone of voice to how much this seems to be in that moment an intellectual question. If it's an intellectual question, like you can't square the circle. If God existed and he were loving, he would stop the evil and suffering in the world. If it's that, I would be talking about what's called the free will defense, which classically basically means that in order for love to be possible, freedom has to exist. And we know that in every sphere of life. If we take the area of romantic relationships, our young men and young women understand that the importance of consent in a sexual relationship, and that if there is no consent, that is not a loving thing to do. It's an act of violence to impose yourself on another person. And God made a world in which love is possible. And that means a world within which we as human beings have the capacity to make decisions about moral decisions, about whether we're in relationship with him, but also about how we order our lives. And so when we look at the world around us, sin and suffering and evil are a consequence of human exercise of moral decision and choice. And that's downflow of God actually creating a world in which love is possible because he is loving. So then obviously you might want to talk about God redeeming the world and his answer to suffering in Christ, but just framing it philosophically around consent and freedom, I've found really helpful.
Yeah, that's good. I like that a lot. The books you can find at amyorr-ewing.com. Let's talk about another website and your work here in the United States, advocate-collective.org. Talk about, certainly I know through your speaking and writing, you're making a difference, but talk about advocacy and the importance of that for those of us who are following Jesus.
Yeah, thank you so much, Eric. That's a wonderful question to be asked. So, I would say my work has different strands in it, and this word advocate really I guess, encapsulates different aspects of what God's called me to do. The first strand is public advocacy for the Christian faith. And sometimes we might call that apologetics or public proclamation. It might look like speaking at a major company, a bank, or, a tech company about God, and then answering people's questions about the Christian faith, or being on campus and doing that. And, that verse where Paul talks about us being ambassadors for Christ, it's about making the connections between the Christian faith and the questions in the culture. So that would be public advocacy. And then the second strand is around advocating for people who've experienced harm, moral injury, sexual or spiritual abuse, often in religious contexts. And it is those very deep experiences that have shaped their decision either to not engage any further with faith, or having been a Christian to walk away from faith, to deconstruct that faith. And so some of my work has been in advocating for survivors of those kinds of harms to be really listened to have their voices listened to be taken seriously, and, where investigations have needed to happen, for those to happen in a just and honest and transparent way. And then also to create a fund that makes provision for people who are survivors of that kind of traumatic experience to receive the kind of help they need, which might be some therapy by people who are actually skilled to offer that kind of specialized help. And part of my own story is that I needed that myself, having worked in a context where, I experienced extremely abusive behavior, and I just desperately needed help, and then have been involved now in advocating for others.
I'm so sorry that happened to you, but I love how God is using you to bring freedom and healing to others.
Praise him.
Whether it's from your own experience or others, what have you seen in addition to counseling,
Mm.
a path towards healing, or
Yeah.
even for the abuser? Like, have you seen any repent and get the help they need? And if so, what are some resources there? I just would love to hear more on that.
Yeah, honestly, that's quite rare, I think, in my experience, that has been quite rare for an abuser to really own in any way that is honourable their behaviour. And so actually quite a lot of the work is around untangling, particularly in Christian contexts, untangling some of the gaslighting and even sort of spiritual framing that has enabled that behaviour to happen. So often where there is sexual abuse, clergy sexual abuse, there will be, systems around that have a very strong emphasis on loyalty to the Lord's anointed. And loyalty means that no one is allowed to discuss their concerns about anything with anyone. And even raising a concern flags you as a sort of dangerous, disloyal person that needs re-education. There's also a lot of gaslighting as well, where you might experience, your own conscience is raising red flags, but those are dismissed and people are encouraged to kind of doubt their own intuitions, or maybe even what the Holy Spirit is kind of warning them about. And that's often framed in spiritual language. So, you're cast as being very judgmental when actually all you're doing is humbly asking a question, or even, you are the bad person for thinking this terrible, evil thought that might even be possible of this great leader. So there's so much that's confusing, and often Christians might find their own piety, their own devotion to Jesus, their own desire to be humble and respectful and loyal kind of weaponized against them to enable abuse to continue or be covered. And so some of my writing, my latest book is called Lead Like the Real You. It's a book for women leaders, but in some of my writing, I really unpack some of that and what it might look like to sort of walk through those experiences and still come out loving Jesus and loving his word with deep conviction about the goodness of God, but perhaps also deep conviction about the fallenness of man and the possibility of wolves coming among God's people and people who hold the name of Christ behaving in ways that are really harmful.
Yeah. It's an absolute tragedy, something that is absolutely real and the church needs to deal with. I love that you're doing so and the way you're handling it. And in many ways, it's a testimony to the world around us that we acknowledge we're broken people who need Jesus. And sometimes those broken people wield power in unhealthy and even evil ways. But that doesn't diminish the realness of God and his love for his bride.
Do you know what? For the leaders listening to you, I heard this statistic that someone who's really worked at the forefront of, supporting survivors of sexual abuse in particular, I heard a statistic that this individual said that in over 100 cases where he was, working as a lawyer for a survivor of sexual abuse, never once did a pastor attend a hearing in support of that abuse victim, and they were always, Christians, churchgoers, and he didn't have one single experience of a leader showing up for a vulnerable person. But in all the 100 cases that he had dealt with, there were leaders who came to support the perpetrator at the trial. And, I think that perpetrators do need to be visited in prison and do need the gospel and, do need Christians to care, but so do the survivors of these horrific experiences. And in my own life, I've been in court now a few times in different settings or kind of advocated in investigation or police interviews and sat with survivors of rape and sexual abuse. And always it has been, I've hardly said a word, but it's been the most incredible gospel opportunity to be a Christian leader, in those settings. Yeah, to have conversations with people about Jesus, and, just the wider world to see that we care about this, that harm and injustice and abuse matter to us as leaders and matter to Jesus.
That's right. Yeah. For more, advocate-collective.org. Lead like the real you. So grateful for your time with us, Amy. Keep up your amazing work, and God bless.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for joining us for the Innovative Church Leaders Podcast. Go to my website, ericbryant.org, for my newsletter and free resources.